Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Daffy's Roundtable. On today's episode, we are joined by Damian Mckay, a reptile keeper from Australia. Damian is one of the owners of Copperhead Customs, a company that they build custom enclosures for you, but then they also fully design and scape it for you. And that's the part that Damian does. So the big topic for today's episode is really functionality versus aesthetics when it's to building and scaping enclosures. Damian walks us through his thought process when designing, what he takes into consideration, how he makes sure it's built to benefit the animal, but still look aesthetically pleasing for us. We then also dive into the change in animal behavior when you're giving the right size enclosure and scape, and we also talk about water features, the benefits of them, and there's so much good info in this episode, and I think you're all going to enjoy listening to it. But before we do that, allow me to thank enclsoure for sponsoring this podcast and making this episode possible. enclsoure makes quality products for our pet reptiles to make them feel at home. Okay, let's get into it. Everybody, please help me welcome Damian Mckay of Copperhead Customs. Damian, hello.
Hey, how are we doing?
Doing great. Thank you very much for joining me. How are you doing?
All good. Yeah, I'm pretty good. Pretty good.
Awesome.
Been
I'm very excited.
a busy last couple of days, but we'll get there.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm sure we're gonna get into why it's been a busy couple of days.
Yep.
But
Yeah,
before
we
we
can
do
do
that,
that.
tell us about yourself, how you got into the hobby, and sort of the story up till now.
All right. So, for those of you that don't know me, my name's Damian, and I created a company called Copperhead Customs. Building custom backgrounds is where it started. That happened because I was broke and couldn't afford a universal rock background. And the more I looked at what was available on the market, it wasn't suitable for the animal that I wanted it for. So I wanted it for my original carpet python, who is behind me. I think you can see him just there. And he's just under 7 foot long at 26 years old this year. And I had him in a converted fish tank, which everyone says don't do that, but I did it and it worked fine. He only escaped once. But the issue that I was having is he always wanted to be on the little lip that the glass lids would sit on. And he was too big and he'd fall off. And I had heaps of branches and whatnot. And that enclosure was only 2 foot tall. And that's sort of where my journey really started with the business. Because I was like, well, if he can't sit on that lip, then he can't sit on the wedge. He's on a universal rock background. So I wanted to create something that he could use. Then I realized, well, if he wants to be up higher, then why not go taller? So I looked at different enclosures, ended up talking to a few different enclosure builders, and now I work with one of those people to create custom enclosures, and then I do all the rock work and all the kit out for those. So that's the story of how the business started. How my keeping started was in primary school. I had a to be honest, it was probably before primary school. My mum recently told a story where I was at kinder and the teachers were like, "Oh, he needs to work at a zoo or something when he grows up." He's just obsessed. He's obsessed with animals. Yeah, he's obsessed with animals. He's obsessed with bugs. I remember going to primary school with like mason jars and catching spiders and insects and stuff, and all the teachers thought I was nuts. Except for one. There was a teacher named Roger Berry, and unfortunately I haven't been able to track him down since. But he was an environmental studies teacher. And we did everything from, they got funding to create a frog habitat in the school, so we had this little fenced off area, and all the students dug out a pond, planted it all. So that was pretty cool. But he would bring in his reptiles into school, which got me hooked. Then they had a program called the Bright Spikes program, which if kids showed certain interests or talents in things, they would get to do these little workshops, and I always got pulled aside to do the animal-based sort of and nature-based sort of stuff. Which a lot of it, I'm pretty sure, was just cheap labor because we were planting trees and revegetating parts of the school and all sorts. But that was really good. We even did surveying. We went out into the forests and surveyed tree cover and all sorts. So then I must have started bugging my parents at some point, and we started looking at bearded dragons. And my parents were like, well, if you're going to do this, you need to do your research. And they had these little pamphlet booklets, care guides, I guess would have been what it was. And they would make me read them all. And we decided against a bearded dragon. And eventually, I'm not even sure how it happened, but we landed on a carpet python. And so they found a breeder. I've actually recently gotten back in contact with him, and he's still going. He breeds green tree pythons now, so it's pretty cool to see him still out there, still in the game.
That's awesome. Yeah.
And yeah, so I remember going there. We walked into the house, and there was a gigantic, all live planted green tree frog enclosure, and so kept going in. Then he's got a red belly black snake, which is a venomous elapid native here in Australia. He's got one of those in an enclosure. I was like, wow, this is pretty crazy. Then we went out into the backyard, and he had this big long shed. Walk in, and it's just enclosures down one wall and racks down the other wall. And like walking down, looking at everything, and all the adults were in enclosures, and then all the racks were all the babies. And he had all sorts. He had scrub pythons and heaps of different stuff. One of the scrub pythons, he was telling us, actually grabbed him. He ended up getting rid of the big stuff because, he was cleaning enclosures, and he had been working. He bred rats as well to feed them, and he went from one room to the other and got the order the wrong way around, and the big female scrub decided that he smelled like lunch and grabbed him and coiled him. And the only reason he managed to get out of that situation was because the dog was going nuts, and his wife came out to see what the dog was going nuts about. And here he is with a scrub python wrapped.
Wow.
Trying to have some lunch, but
wow. Do you know roughly how big the female scrub was?
Well, from memory, when I was 10, I remember looking at it going, the scales were bigger than my fingernails. Okay. So she would have been a good size scrub. Wow. Which, if that gets around your neck, you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, for sure.
But so we sort of looked through all the drawers, and first one he came across was jungle pythons. And I remember him opening the lid and just seeing these little brightly coloured machine guns, bang, 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 striking out. He's like, yeah, maybe not for your first snake. Puts the lid back on, puts it back in, goes to the next one. We went through a few until we reached the Darwin carpets, which are now described as top-end carpets on our licensing system. But and I was like, yeah, they're pretty cool. And same thing, a fair few of them were striking, and he would wave his hand over the tub and they'd strike, and he'd pull those ones out, wave again, strike. And then my boy was the only one that didn't strike. It's like, all right, that's a good place to start. And my dad made the first enclosure, and it's been steady going since there. Dropped off a bit when I was at school. When I first moved out of home, I moved interstate. My parents kept the snake and looked after him, thank God. But once I got back, tried a few different hobbies, and I always found that like people would drop off. You'd start something with mates, and they'd lose interest. And then when I did that first background, because I wanted it to look nicer, I was just sucked straight back into the reptile world. I was like, I don't need to rely on other people for this. Like, I've got the animals, I've got the creativity to kit out the enclosures. And then slowly I got involved with the VHS, which is the shirt that I'm wearing, and that's the Victorian Herpetological Society. And now they're like a second family. I've made so many friends that
That's awesome.
I'll have for life. So
Yeah. Do
but yeah,
they are
that's
is it
how it
like
all
monthly
started.
meetups and all that with the
Yeah. So they do a big meeting once every 3 months, and then we do a yearly expo.
That's awesome. That's very cool. Yeah, we have a lot of expos up here, but not enough, societies or communities meetings, I guess. There's no like the fish clubs. There's fish clubs all over the province I live in, and they're all doing like monthly meetups and stuff. But nobody's really doing, or to my knowledge at least, there's not enough reptile ones happening, which it would be cool to see. But anyway, so that's awesome. So that first background kind of inspired you to start to dive back into it and to create, I guess, bigger and better enclosures. So before we get into the actual mechanics of the enclosure, let's say, one thing we commonly hear is that like the husbandry is one of the main reasons. The husbandry of the animals is one of the main reasons that these animals are getting sick or things are happening. And then there's always this talk of like, well, you can't really do really good husbandry in elaborate setups. And what's your opinion on that? If my question makes sense.
I think a big part of the issues with husbandry come down to ventilation for a start. In Australia, if you try and keep in a mesh top enclosure which has really good ventilation, you really struggle to keep your heat where you need it. And then people start doing silly things like putting 250 watt bulbs, and it gets crazy, and then they burn their houses down. It's not good. So ventilation, I think, is a really, really big issue, because if you don't have your substrate dry enough and you don't have good ventilation, then you start running into fungal issues. It's a good, once you put a heat lamp in an environment that's damp and doesn't have good ventilation, you just, and I think so. That, in my opinion, is one of the big things, and we really go out of our way to make sure that with the designs that we do with enclosures, that we put lots and lots of ventilation. And I'm working on a product which will have small computer fans that you can run on timers to create even more. I think personally that a 4x2x2 enclosure is too small for 99% of the adult animals that we keep. And if you've got, say, paper towel on the bottom, that animal goes to the toilet, it's basically forced to sit in that. Whereas if you keep in a big enclosure, animal goes to the toilet, it can get up off the ground, it can get out of that mess and away from it. It's not going to choose to sit in it 9 times out of 10. Some animals will, but and then that gives you time to spot clean. So even though the enclosure behind me is bioactive, like it's got a crazy amount of isopods, it's got springtails, all the rest of it. With a 7-foot snake in it, it takes a lot to break down that. So I'm still spot cleaning, but you don't get that smell when the animal goes to the toilet because the space is so big and the liquids and bacteria are getting broken down. And then I'm basically just removing the fur and bone. Other than that, people, I don't even know where it's coming from, but people get really overwhelmed by lighting and heating.
Yeah, That's actually
And
my next question was, do you think it's harder to keep lighting and heating stable in the larger size enclosures than it is in the second?
it depends what you're trying to achieve. If I wanted this entire enclosure to be 35 degrees, then yes, but I don't. I want the top section to be that, and then I want him to be able to get away from it if he wants. And the bottom of this enclosure sits at about 18 degrees Celsius into the really low 20s on a warm day. And I remember when I first started, we were told, don't even bother with a big enclosure, you won't be able to heat it. And lighting and heating has changed a lot since then. Like, we were keeping with a basic house globe that was painted blue.
Yeah, of course.
And trying to heat something with that, this size, it'd be impossible. But with how far technology's come, how far our knowledge has come, you want that gradient. You don't want it all to be that hot. And I see with all of my animals, they'll come up, they'll get the heat that they want, and then they'll go about either hiding somewhere cooler, or if it's just before nighttime, then they'll be active all night. So you don't need to be heating the entire space to 30 plus degrees for carpet pythons. Some other animals, maybe you do. Like a lot of your arid species would want a higher ambient, but they still want that night drop as well. So you've got to be running timers and light cycling. There's various other ways that you can go about heating a larger space, spreading your light fixtures further apart. So you're creating a larger basking zone, and therefore the heat has less distance to travel to heat that space. And then with the fan idea, I'm still in the testing stages of it, but I think that if you have air being drawn in on the side where your heating is and out on the side on your cool end, then you would be able to transfer that warmer air across, creating a higher ambient. But I'm still playing around with that, so that's sort of something for the future.
That's a very interesting concept. I know when houses get too warm here, and I don't know how effective this is. I've just heard it. I've never tried it. And people don't have ACs. A lot of people will tell them, like, put a bag of ice over your fans and let it blow into the room, and it'll bring down the ambient of the room. But I've never personally tried it. I assume the opposite would work the same way.
Yeah, you would think so. There's also I tend to borrow a lot from other industries, and in the greenhouse world, with the popularity of tropical plants, looking into how they heat greenhouses, there's a lot of different products that we don't see in the reptile industry that can be used.
Yeah. And is there any examples of that? Like, is it also like sort of air transfer that heats it up?
There's a product called a tube heater, which is supposed to be really, really efficient and good at heating spaces, and they can be mounted on the wall or on the ceiling, and then you've got a cage over the top of it. I've seen, the first time I discovered them was on a monitor page, and he was using it to control the ambient of the cool side of his enclosure, which worked. He said it worked amazingly, but the only downside was he had to jerry rig a cage, because the cages that you can get for them are open-ended, so your animal could get between the cage and the heating element.
Yeah, and on the topic of the cage, in your enclosures, well, first of all, are your lighting, is it usually on the inside, or do you keep them on the outside? And then if they are in the inside, how do you kind of what do you do to prevent animals from getting all tangled up, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, so my cages are on the inside, and it's something that I eventually want to move away from. I'm good friends with Brad from Brad's Bioactive Builds, and the way that he does his, with the hole cut out in the ceiling, the mesh over the hole, and then the dome sits on top, I'm thinking of going that route. And that's just to create more space. That's another reason I'm not a fan of 2 foot tall enclosures, is because once you hang a light on the inside, you've reduced that by half. And yeah, for especially carpet pythons, I mean, that's all I keep. I've worked with other animals through other people's collections, but an animal that wants to be up high to feel safe, if you temp gun the top corner, opposite corner to your heat, in a 2 foot tall enclosure, your hotspot where the basking zone is can be 32 to 35 degrees, and that top corner will be in the 40s because the heat rises and gets trapped. So not only is it not much space to climb, but now that zone is so hot that they're not going to be able to sit there long term because they'll overheat.
Yeah. And is that sorry to interrupt, but is that specifically when the lamp or the dome is on the inside, or is it also the same thing when it's sitting on the outside?
In my experience, that's when it's on the inside. But yeah, that's more one of my gripes. You don't get it so much with really large enclosures because they can still be up high and drop down out of that heat.
Right.
With that more space. But if it's only 2 foot tall, they can't. It's either on the ground or off the ground. There's no in between.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That makes sense. I also. Okay, go ahead.
So the reason that I want to switch from inside to outside with my lighting is just to create more space, and so you're not looking at the globes, because it's the one thing. Like I've got a huge plinth on the top of this, and you can still see the globes. It's hidden a lot of them, especially the Jungle Dawn bars, which are insanely bright when you're looking straight at it. But yeah, you can still see it more than I would like. So I would like to create a system where there's a hood on top. I'll go Brad's route of cutting the hole so it's still trapping the heat. It's not just letting it escape. And then I'll control the ventilation through computer fans.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think that sounds like it would work. Not that I have any knowledge in building tanks.
Yeah, that's the plan. You always, whenever you try something, like things can go wrong. Like you've got to be ready to adapt to and sort of observe it and be ready to adapt, I guess.
For sure. And the plants in the enclosure behind you, are those live plants or are those it's kind of hard to.
So I do both.
Both. Okay.
I'm not the most patient person in the world, so planting a tank and waiting for it to grow in, as rewarding as it is and as cool as it is to see the plants, what thrives, what doesn't, what's growing, I want it to look good now. So
yeah,
I'll put live plants, and then I've worked out that I can, if I get good quality fake plants, I can mix the two and it still gels. It's not this stark contrast between like glossy plastic and then the live plants. You've got to find good quality plants, which is something that I'm going to start selling because it's taken a long time for me to curate what's good and what's not. And I've wasted a lot of money on plants that looked good online and then turned out to be pretty crappy.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. Like just from looking at the tank behind you, I can't tell if they're like the fake ones look real or what I think might be the fake ones look real.
These here, these are fake.
Okay.
These are real. These are real.
Cool. Yeah. So I guess my question would be, wait. Also, did you just reach in and grab? Is the tank open?
Yeah. I took the doors off so it's not glaring the camera.
Okay, cool. Okay, awesome. Yeah. So I guess my question would be, because I'm the same thing. I'm super impatient when it comes to growing plants, and I'm also not very good at it. Especially in like when I was doing dart frog stuff, it was fairly easy. You just throw whatever into the tank. You don't even have to root it. You just throw it in. It kind of like grows wherever it goes. But in the carpet python enclosures, they're essentially both have no plants in them whatsoever. Now it's just a bunch of cork layered all over the place because they keep killing everything or destroying everything. So
They bulldoze it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was just kind of wondering, yeah, how do you keep some of those plants, or is there a, do you plant them ahead of putting the snake in there and kind of let them establish? Is that what the
No,
secret
I'm
is,
too
or is
impatient for that.
okay? So there's
I'm
this,
way too
it's just a,
impatient.
whatever survives, it survives kind of thing.
Yeah, so it's a lot of trial and error, but pretty much big animal, big plants. So, and that's where big enclosures come in. If I had him in, even say I put him in a 6x2, he's still going to be trying to climb and squashing everything that I put in there. Whereas I can put plants in here and then position them with hardscape that he's going to choose the hardscape over the plant. He still squashes them to some degree, but for the most part, he just sort of goes in between them, then goes back to the more sturdy hardscape. And then, so that's with the Dracaena, which is this one. And then the other plants, I try and select things that can handle getting squashed. So your ficus works well. So it's either got to be able to handle getting squashed or it's going to be big enough that he can't squash it. So I've got Ficus benjamina, that works really well, can handle taking a beating. Yeah, there's been a few others that I've tried. A few of the palms work well. The Cascade palm seems to work really well. But I've got those in enclosures with smaller snakes as well, so they might not hold up as well as they get bigger unless you went a really big, mature plant. But yeah, big snake, you got to get mature plants, otherwise they just destroy them.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Is there, so kind of as you're, maybe we'll kind of walk through it in your the way you process a build or something. Is there a way that you kind of think of things ahead of time so that the setup is functional but still looks good? You know, the
Yeah.
beauty of the tank doesn't take away from, you know, the basking spots or any of that importance.
Yeah, so especially when I'm building, I'm more experimental with my own animals. Not to a detriment. I make sure they've got what they need, but I'll try different things. But when it comes to a client build, first thing I do is ask what animal is going in the enclosure. I make my setups suitable for that animal because I know that for me, that suitability was what I was seeking. And then I thought to myself, well, let's go the step further. Let's research the animal's natural behaviors and support that. So if they like being in rock crevices, I'm going to make a background with rock crevices. If they're big bodied, I'm going to make sure that the ledges are big enough for them to rest on, not just hang on the side of a cliff face. I want them to be able to climb up the cliff face and sit and bask as they would in nature. Because even though these animals are not wild caught, because I think there is some permits here that you can wild catch, but for the most part, all of our stuff is captive bred. Those animals have the instinct for those natural behaviors ingrained in them. And I've seen that through like adding the pond, adding the misting systems, which 99% of people with carpet pythons don't or shouldn't do because their enclosures are too small. Yeah.
Sorry, can I interrupt you real quick there?
Yeah.
Before we jump into the ventilation, you said or shouldn't do. Is that in terms of it becomes over too humid, over moistured? Like, why do you think people shouldn't be adding this to yeah.
In reptile stores here, you will not find. Oh, no, I won't say you won't find. Occasionally, you'll find a large enclosure, but they'll charge insane amounts of money for it. But 9 out of 10 enclosures in a reptile store will be a 2 foot tall maybe 6 foot long if you're lucky, but most of them will be a 4 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot. And most of them so picture your enclosure and you've got your substrate barrier and then you got the top counterpart to that. They put the vents along those. As soon as you put substrate in it, you bury the vents. So now you've impeded on the airflow. The other thing is they'll leave, I've seen a lot of pine enclosures, which people hate pine, but I don't think they understand how timber works. But they're raw, they're not sealed, they're not waterproofed. So that's going to absorb moisture, it's going to start to rot, it's going to grow mold. Even the melamine enclosures, the stuff that I've seen in stores, they don't seal the joins. All of the stuff we build, we seal all the joins to stop any moisture getting in there, because that's where mold's going to grow.
Right.
It's also for durability, like your enclosure's going to last a lot longer. Like this enclosure behind me is melamine, and as some people may have seen, I recently flooded it, and there's no swelling at all. I've been running a bioactive system with misters and foggers for multiple years without any issues. Melamine is a very good product that can hold up to moisture if it's prepared properly. Everyone thinks that as you sneeze at it, and it's going to swell and fall apart and disintegrate. It doesn't. The only damage, when I first pulled this apart and redid it, after about 1.5 to 2 years of heavily watering live plants, there was a little bit of sagging and rippling on the very bottom panel where, through my substrate barrier into the drainage layer, it had sort of sifted a lot of silt from the substrate that was then sitting damp in the very bottom. And it was just that sitting on the melamine that affected it. So where I'm saying they shouldn't, I don't think you should go get your first snake and try and do this. This is what you should be aiming to eventually learn how to do.
Yeah.
But some fake plants, enough space to climb and support those natural behaviors and correct heat. And I'm not a fan of substrates that are not loose substrates. I prefer loose substrates because people have good intentions and they're like, oh yeah, I'll clean it when it gets dirty. But as someone that started out we use like a marine carpet, like carpet that was designed for boats, as our first substrate. Every time the snake went to the toilet, I had to pull everything out, pull that carpet out, take it outside, pressure wash it, let it dry, then put it back in. And that goes for fake grass, it goes for a reptile carpet, it goes for paper towel, newspaper. Especially in a small enclosure, but in any enclosure, you're not going to clean it straight away. Yeah. It doesn't absorb enough that your animal's out of the mess, out of the bacteria. Like in 26 years of keeping, I've never had to take one of my animals to the vet. Like I've never had a respiratory infection. He's had a couple of scrapes from his escape attempt. But even that,
and you
attribute
this to like just proper husbandry.
Yeah. So I went from carpet to kitty litter, like a paper pallet kitty litter.
Okay.
Which a lot of people use, but again, it's designed to absorb the muck. So you're just left with a husk pallet that's 99% fur.
Yeah.
And like there's no puddle, there's like nothing that they're going to go and sit in, they're going to crawl through. It's just, I think that A loose substrate gives you the ability to clean a lot quicker and easier by spot cleaning, and then do a full change once a month or once every couple of weeks, rather than it having to be a full change every single time. And considering how much people overfeed their reptiles, they go into the toilet a lot more.
Yeah.
Like, if you're feeding weekly, then that animal's toileting, especially, like, we'll go with carpet pythons. Lizards are even worse. But
Lizards,
that
it becomes
animal's
daily.
toileting every second week. So yeah, you got a lizard, people are like, oh, you can't keep a bearded dragon on loose substrate. Well, that's incorrect, and you need to study what causes impaction for a start. But
Yeah.
yeah, that animal's going to the toilet every couple of days or every day, and now you've got to do a full clean every day.
Yeah.
That's, depending on what you're using in the bottom, that's an hour out of your day every single day.
Right. That makes sense. Do you, and then we'll jump back to what happened with the pond and kind of the train of thought we're on. But just since you quickly touched on the bearded dragon and that, do you ever, first of all, do you include the substrate in the builds when you're giving them to the clients? And then the second question would be, do you ever do arid builds, arid backgrounds, and yeah, and then I guess what's your opinion on arid bioactive? I just gave you a
All
lot of
right,
questions.
so no, you're right. I am in the process of building out some substrate kits that I want them to be a bioactive kit, but not an all-in-one bioactive kit. Substrates should have layers of different consistencies, different nutritional value. I think one of the things that irks me is, well, other than the fact that people say the bearded dragons can't be kept on loose substrate, is people keep them too dry. They're like, oh, you can't have any percentage of humidity in your enclosure. Well, that's not how a desert works. A desert has a humidity spike in the morning and a humidity spike in the afternoon when those temperatures are dropping. Deserts get quite cold at night. I did a lot of camping as a kid. We lived out of tents for 3 months, traveling from the bottom of Australia to the very top of Australia and back. And I can tell you right now that in the middle of those deserts, it can get really, really cold, but during the day, it's maxing out thermometers. So you have to have both, and that is hard to replicate in an enclosure, but it is possible. So that's something I'm working towards. Generally, I don't. I've made some custom kits for people. I made one for carpet pythons, and I'm currently putting together one for some bearded dragons. What was the other part of the question? So do I supply substrate, which generally no, but the future, yes.
Okay, yeah, awesome. And then do you ever work on arid builds for your clients?
Yes. Yeah, the funny thing is, even though I keep all rainforest species, I probably do more arid setups than anything else.
That's cool. Is that just generally because more people are keeping arid things in your area?
Bearded dragons are insanely popular here.
Yeah.
Although a lot of the small monitor species are as well, so they're getting more and more popular.
Cool. Okay, and then so what do you think of bioactive arid enclosures? Do you think it's possible? Do you think there's a way of it being done? Yeah. What's your opinion?
Yeah, I think it is possible. Again, it's really difficult in a small enclosure. The smaller the enclosure, I think, the harder it is because you're putting a big animal in a small enclosure. It's not like people look at bioactive and think dart frogs because they've been doing it the longest. Problem is that we're trying to take that theory, which is designed for an animal this big, and do it for an animal this big in an enclosure that's not that much bigger than what they're keeping a dart frog in. So the balance is gone. I think bioactive is almost, it's probably not entirely, but it's almost impossible if you don't have live plants, because the bugs are designed to break down the waste, or the cleanup crew is designed to break down that waste that goes into a form that the plants can gain access to. Now, there's two issues that there are with the bioactive world. If those bugs are creating the frass, so their waste, which feeds the plants, on the surface, then it's not getting to the root system of the plants. The other thing is, not many people can keep live plants alive in an arid setup, which is why I want to create the bioactive substrates with layers. So you have your nutrition layer that your plant's roots are sitting in, and then you have your sands and clays and stone on top of that they're growing through. But you need to mist or spray down your enclosure so that water absorbs that nutrients and then seeps down through the top layer. So, and that can be really tricky with a bearded dragon, because you don't want the humidity to last long term. You want it to spike in the morning, dry out through the day, spike in the afternoon. So you're very limited with how much you can mist without bumping that humidity up. But the beardy vet, he did a podcast a while back where he was like, he gets slammed on bearded dragon groups because he missed his bearded dragons both day and night. But part of what he said was a lot of the impaction issues are actually caused from dehydration. If they're properly hydrated, their system flushes through sand bed. It's like what wild bearded dragons eat sand all the time. So you don't see them dropping dead of impaction. And then at one of the VHS meetings, there was another vet did a talk, one of our main vets here, and he said that most impaction that he sees is not from sand, it's from undigested carapace off of the feeder insects. Again, dehydration. Then
hot enough, or dehydration as well.
They're not being kept hot enough. They're not getting proper hydration because they don't want to drink from standing water. You spray down a bearded dragon, and he'll immediately start drinking the droplets that run down their face.
Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah, and standing water is something that sort of got me set down the path of doing ponds and misting systems and all sorts, because a lot of people have issues with their carpet pythons not shedding properly, start doing crazy things like injecting the feeders with water, stuff like that. And I was like, it can't be right. Like, I understand that when you freeze a frozen rat, like when you take a rat and freeze it and then defrost it, some of that moisture content is leaving. But in all, it shouldn't be leaving to the point that your animal's not hydrated whatsoever. And then people are saying, oh, well, when you put new water in, they come and drink it straight away. It's because they're desperate.
They're super thirsty.
So, yeah, I'm like, something's not right here. And similar to the bearded dragon argument with the substrate, I don't like it when people go, oh, well, carpet pythons can't handle humidity. I'm like, hang on. They're from Queensland, which is the most humid place in Australia.
Yeah.
Like, how can they not handle humidity? And it's not that they can't handle humidity, it's that people's ventilation is really crappy, so their environment ends up holding on to too much moisture instead of getting wet, drying out. And anyone that keeps plants, like, look at, next time you're at the plant store or hardware store, go through and look at it. Most of them, they want well-drained soil. They want to get a drink, dry out.
Yeah.
Like, and reptiles are the same way. They don't want to be sitting in a puddle. But when I put the misting systems in these enclosures, and to start with, honestly, it was for the plants. And I was like, I think I can manage it. If I work out the spacing, make sure my ventilation's good, I think I can manage to do it. All of a sudden, I noticed that as soon as they come on, the snakes will even come out of hides and come and drink the water that's misting onto them, and misting onto the plants and misting onto the walls. And they're immediately out. Like one of my girls, she comes out, she'll be in her cave hide. As soon as she realizes the misting system is on, she'll come out, start drinking. And I was like, huh, that's interesting. I was like, so I wonder if it's standing water, if they sort of like a chameleon. They don't like, well, chameleons won't do it at all, but if they prefer moving water. So then I put the pond in, and let's be honest, the main reason for that is because waterfalls are cool, and I wanted a waterfall.
100%. They look cool. They sound cool. Everything. Yeah, 100%.
But my theory was that maybe the reason that they're found along creek systems is because they want that running water. Now, I was proven wrong with that because I put it in, and I didn't see him drink from it at all. And I was like, that's interesting. I put him down right next to it, and he did drink from it. So they will drink from it. But the most successful hydration I've found for carpet pythons is misting. Now, what I did discover with the pond is that it triggers hunting behavior. As soon as you put moving water into the enclosure, every single one that I've done it with, you come in that night or the next night and they're hanging over the top of the water, waiting for prey.
As in waiting, as in watching what's coming out of the water, or sitting in the water watching what's coming to drink from the water, if that makes sense.
I've had both. Mostly, from what I can see, it's they're sitting above the water waiting for something to come and get a drink, and then they're going to ping it. But my big guy, so in when was it that he did it? So
that's so fascinating.
I think it was last year. He's never soaked. Like, he's always had big water bowls. He's never sat in the water. And I was like, where is he? I'm looking, and he's got lots of like built-in caves and plenty of places that he can hide in this enclosure, and couldn't see him. And then I noticed that he was in the water. He was in the pond. I was like, oh, that's kind of crazy. Like, and he stayed there for ages. I'm like, far out. Like, he must be getting kind of cold. And I picked him up, and he was cold as. And I put him up in the heat, and he soaked up some heat. Then I came in the next day, he's back in the water. I checked him over. I'm like, no mites. Like, I don't understand. And I suppose we can talk about feeding for a sec. I feed with very big gaps in between. This guy eats once every 3 months and holds perfect condition. I'm comfortable doing that because when he was a juvenile, he went on a feed strike and he went just under 12 months without eating. And that was as a young animal. Now he's, even with that and even with getting fed with big gaps in between, he's pushing 7 foot. So you don't need to feed like crazy when it comes to ambush animals. Their systems are so efficient when it comes to calories that feeding them every single week is just insane. I think the reason that people do that is because that's what pet shops and breeders tell them, because that's how you get an animal established. That's how you get that feeding habit going. Once that feeding habit's going, even my young animals only eat every 2 to 3 weeks. And I've never had any issues. Hell, if they turn down a feed, I'm mean and go, all right, well, I'm not even going to offer you anything for the next 3 weeks. So now you've gone 6 weeks without a feed. And guess what? That next time you offer them a feed, they ain't turning it
Yeah, they're taken right away. Absolutely, yeah. That makes sense.
So back to the pond, it had been a decent gap. And I was like, okay. I had the opportunity to get a frozen guinea pig. So I fed him the frozen guinea pig, ate it easy. I was like, but they're pretty high in fat. So I'm like, instead of 3 months, you're going 5 months.
Okay.
So it had been about 5 months, and he's sitting in the water. I'm like, that's really weird. And I remember seeing olive pythons. Do you know the app iNaturalist?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah. So for those of you that don't know, iNaturalist is an app where you can go through, look at different areas, and see what animals are in those areas. Or you can do the opposite, look up the animal and find out where it's been seen.
Yeah.
And I saw pictures of these olive pythons sitting in water troughs. I was like, that's a bit weird. Well, I wonder if it's because of heat. And then I sort of thought about it. I was like, well, what does a crocodile do? It sits under the water and waits for something to come and get a drink and grabs it by the face.
Yeah.
I was like, okay, I wonder if that's what's going on. So, thought out a rat, and I don't just dangle it in front of them. I make them come to me. And straight away I see the tongue. Boom. I was like, well, he's interested. So I sort of thump, bit of movement, bit of vibrations, and he came out of that water and hit that rat harder than he's ever hit anything. And then dragged it into the water. I was like, oh, great, now I've got to do a water change.
Of course, yeah.
But that's what he was doing. It was hunting behavior.
That's fascinating.
So, yeah, and I've had other people that have heard me say this on podcasts try it and then tag me, and they've put a little, you don't need much, just a small container of water with a little filter or an air stone. And, yeah, straight away, they're like, came in tonight, bam, hanging over the water. It's like,
that's so interesting. Yeah. My carpet recently started doing this, my male, and now he spends a lot of time hanging over or in the water. I mean, he's been fed recently, so I don't think that's what it is, but maybe I'll try again and see. I have been wondering why.
A good way to do like a pond, if you're going to do a pond, I would highly recommend filtration. Like, keep that water moving. Water's considered stagnant after, I think it's not even 12 hours of sitting there. So you don't want to be, say you put use a tray, like a kitty litter tray or a seedling tray. If you don't have any form of filtration or anything to move that water around, it's going to be really annoying really quickly to change that every single day.
For sure. Do you heat the pond? Do you heat the water?
No, I don't. I have considered it, but I don't really see any need to at this point. I might change that when I do my final design, because my final design I want to have the bottom in 3 sections, with the front section looking like you're looking into a creek or a river, and then the riverbank goes up. So awesome. Basically a gigantic paludarium.
Yeah. Yeah. When you say gigantic, something like the size of the one behind you?
I'd probably go bigger, to be honest.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Okay, so let's talk about the pond. So I guess what did you originally do, and then what happened, and what is your solution? Maybe walk us through.
Okay, so I'm up to generation number 4 of the pond design.
Yeah.
So the first thing I did was try to find a prefab pond that would fit, and I couldn't. They were all too big. So then I took the waterfall section off of one of those and positioned it above a storage container and ran that, and it worked. And I was like, okay, that's cool. And then it just didn't look natural enough. It was too hard to find. The waterfall section just looked like it was floating in the air. So then I changed the design and had 2 containers stacked. So the water would run out of this one into this one. that worked all right. I used like pond liner and had it so it would run in there. Was a little bit unstable. So then I was like, okay, well, this is working. But then I sort of started doing more research into the pond industry, because everyone you see that does water features in an enclosure, they do it like a fish tank. They have, if they're going to run filtration, they use fish tank stuff. I was like, well, what do the pond people do? No, I discovered bog and wetland filters. So I was using a sponge filter that was working quite well. But then I just got bored of that and decided to look into other things. And I was like, okay, so what if I take that and shrink that down? I was like, if we go with a bog filter, basically water runs in from the pond into the bottom of it, filters through gravel and sand, and then runs out of that back into the pond. So I tried that. I got 2 containers, so they stacked like that, had taps coming out and running in. And that worked pretty good. And then I was like, okay, well, I want it to look better. So I put a little ledge for it to run down onto and then in. And that was where I stuffed up, because even though I siliconed it and sealed it and stacked rocks and put pond sealer, it found a gap and was trickling, and it was a really, really slow trickle. And it worked amazingly. Like, my water clarity was pristine. It was so clear. And I went with the dirted tank sort of approach. So that's, you're putting a dirt substrate in the bottom of the pond. Then you put sand and gravel over the top. Your plants get all their nutrients from that. So when I first did it, it was basically chocolate milk, the water. And within one water change and 3 days later, and it was crystal clear. Like, I would have drank out of it. It looked that clean. And the issue I ran into, the water level just kept dropping. I was like, oh, that's weird. I wonder if it's just like settling, or if the plants are like heavily planted, because that's the other really good way to filter water.
Yeah.
And then the next day, it dropped down again. I was like, oh no. And I pulled, so it was butted up against the side of the enclosure, and I pulled the container and I could see water. I was like,
on the outside.
I was like, yeah. So I was like, all right, that's a shame, because it was looking really, really good. And I pulled them out, and it had flooded. It had been dripping in one tiny little spot, and it was just enough over a couple of days to flood all the underside. So I pulled it all out. I've got a wet dry vac, which, if you're going to do a good sized pond, is essential for cleaning out the pond. And I was vacuuming it up, and it was seeping in from under the drainage layer. And I was like, oh, this is a nightmare.
Yeah.
So what I actually did is I backfilled it with the soil that the pond was surrounded by. I just backfilled it, let that soak up all the water, dug that out. And then I went on to the version that I'm onto now. So my solution for that issue was to get, it's actually a stock trough. I work at a stock feeds place as my day job. So it's a small stock trough, so it's nice and tough. And I then set a bucket inside that. So that bucket is my bogland filter, my wetland filter. So I filled that up with all of the gravel and sand, have the pump, and I made sure the pipe was in the bounds of the main trough, runs up into that bucket. And then I drilled holes in the side of that bucket. So then that runs back into the pond. That way, if anything leaks, if the top part leaks, if the filter leaks, if the pipes leak, it's going to run back into the main pond and not into the enclosure. So I think although it can be done because I did achieve it, I think I got lucky for a really long time as
Yeah.
far as having them stacked separately and doing the whole pond liner thing. Um, it only takes like your animal messing with that in some way, or even sitting in the flow of water,
Right.
and all of a sudden that water's not going back into the pond.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the picture you sent me of it right now. There's a another black, and this may be the same wire. So there's another black wire that's kind of going under the gravel in the pond section.
Yep, that goes to the pump.
So that goes to the pump. Okay, and then
Yep, so I'm just using a submersible pump,
okay,
and then yeah, so that runs out through a hole in the side of the enclosure. That cable.
that's fascinating.
So
Okay,
that's the only part of it that's not self-contained, and water can't run up.
right, for sure. And then can you plant things in the second bucket?
Yes,
I-
so
In the top part of the mug? Yeah.
that bucket's filled pretty much all the way to the top, and then I've got plants sitting in the top of that as a planter, and then the bottom section has still got the dirted bottom. It's starting to clear up a little bit now, but it's going to take a couple of days.
Okay, and then so you've said you haven't actually seen them start drinking from it yet until you put him there. But have does he? You- uh, was the hunting behavior that you mentioned, was this with the pond, or was this before the pond
Yes.
kind of started? It was with the pond.
No, it was with the pond. Yeah, as soon as I added the running water, within a week he was hanging out. So he's got a gigantic log that this log here
Yeah, the one
that
he's on right
runs the
now.
whole
Yeah.
length of the enclosure, and yeah, he'll sit on that. So his cave, let's see, his cave is behind. See this branch going up? That's behind that. So he'll come out of that, out onto this log, and then hang down, and the pond's here. And he'll be in the full S ambush position, hanging directly above that.
That is very cool. That is very cool. How big is he now, the snake?
Uh, he's just under 7 foot,
Okay, wow, yeah,
so yeah, he's a big boy. Which
yeah,
is why I said I'd actually like to go bigger, because fully stretched out, he is longer than this enclosure. On the diagonal, he, yeah, he doesn't fully stretch out that often. You mainly see it. There's a branch. This branch here goes all the way up to the top corner from about halfway down the enclosure, and he'll stretch out along that, and that's when you can really sort of get a perspective of his length.
yeah, that makes sense. And let's talk about like behavior in these bigger setups with all these different things. You've already sort of mentioned with the moving water, you started seeing the hunting behavior. Is there sort of a way to influence behavior based on how you set up the scape? So, like for example, with like shyer animals, if you were to set up the scape a specific way, would there be a potential of having them come out more? Or yeah, what do you think?
Yes. Yeah, so it's an interesting topic, because when I started looking into, I always want to take it further. I always want to learn how to provide more. So I started looking into how zoos do things, and the difference between an enclosure and an exhibit, and some of the really high level zoos, um, even though there's so many places to hide, these animals actually tend to sit out in the open. And now that could be through socialization. They don't see the people as a threat, but a lot of it is they feel comfortable in their environment. They know that they've got places to hide. They know that they're safe. All the features there are there to make them feel safe. So one thing you can do, I designed a crocodile exhibit for Lilydale High School. Um, it was going to be a much bigger project, but it didn't work out.
They have a crocodile
But one of
exhibit
the
in a school?
yeah, they've got a whole zoology
Wow,
wing.
that's awesome.
So this exhibit, it's a gigantic swimming pool with a big acrylic front glass window, and then a land section. And that was when I really first started looking into the zoo style of doing things. And one of the things is you want people to be able to see them more. I'm like, well, if they're 6, 7 plus meters back into this room, you can't really see them from where the glass is. Like, well, what if I did ledges that come right up along the walls to the window so they can sit there? They feel safe because they can bail into the water, but they're closer to the window. And it worked out really well. They bask on those ledges, they sit on those ledges. You can see them nice up and close. And so so there's a few different ways I can do backgrounds. I can do just the back wall, or I can do the side walls. But you can bring those ledges closer to the window. But then you run into the issue, okay, they feel exposed. So there's a keeper in Australia named Peter Birch. He's got a YouTube channel called Colourful Critters. And one of the things that I've actually become pretty good friends with him, and one of the things that we've discussed is the use of visual barriers. And if you put plants that create a bit of a screen, the animals tend to sit out more because they feel like they're hidden, but you can actually still see them. So that's something I started doing a lot more. I'll do a ledge, and then in front of that ledge, I'll have plants coming up. They'll sit out on that ledge in the complete open because they don't feel like they're completely exposed. So then you can take that and go and use hanging plants. If you get a lot of the artificial plants are like big strands of hanging plants. If you put some sort of a hook in the top, in the ceiling of your enclosure, and have it hanging down, pretty much up against the glass, then the animals are more likely to feel safe out in the open because they feel like they're in a more enclosed space.
Yeah, that makes sense. They feel like they're in the middle of a jungle or something, where on all sides there's trees, there's bushiness, there's something to
it feels like more cover than it actually is.
Yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. And then so let's kind of flip the question and look at the reverse of that. I've just, for the sake of it, I'll use crested geckos as an example. Do you think there's too much scape where you're overfilling the tank? And like when you're breeding crested geckos, to get to the crested gecko example, generally breeders will say, like, the more cover you put in there when you put your groups in, whatever you're doing, blah blah blah, the safer they feel, and they like to be crammed into like little balls and into cork tubes and all that, and they feel safer. Obviously, when you get to that stage, you can't see the animal at all. But do you think that there is, even for the animal, too much clutter, let's say, in the tank?
For the animal, I would say it depends on what the clutter is. You've got to make sure, like, there's no point putting a twig into an enclosure with a 7-foot carpet python because they're not going to be able to use it. In saying that, I posted a photo on my Instagram the other day of my little jungle girl here, and she was hanging up. I've got bamboo, like, it kind of looks like a bamboo thicket. All these strands coming up, and she was hanging on 3 of the vertical poles, and there's the smallest little twig, and that was her main anchor point, where she was hanging. Yeah, that's the one. So that was pretty crazy. So they will use smaller stuff than you expect. But yeah, you want to make sure she's got a big branch that goes the full length of her enclosure. I try and do that in all of the setups. Give me 1 sec. The cat's scratching at the door.
Yeah, no worries.
But if you've got functional branches, then you should be fine. If you've just got plants and small stuff, then maybe not. Crested geckos probably not as bad because they're found in more sort of sparse, sticky environments. But yeah, definitely bigger bodied animals, you need to make sure you're supporting. Always start with function. Like once it's functional, then you can decorate it.
Yeah. Yeah, functions versus aesthetics, or function and aesthetics. Function first, then aesthetics, I think is probably the best answer for that.
Yeah. I could literally have it look not naturalistic at all. I could build all of the shelves out of just timber and make a functional space. I could use timber and polypipe and still create a functional space. It looks good for us. It has to be functional for them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I've seen those like sort of those old type zoo displays where, like you're saying, they're almost like shelves just sort of placed against the walls and the backgrounds, whatever, and the snake just sits there out in the open, and that is it looks bad, but it's I guess what you would call functional, easy to clean. There's a height for the animal, but there's also a basking spot, all that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's we keep these animals for a reason, so we might as well kind of enjoy keeping them. And if you have just a very not great looking tank sort of sitting in your living room or whatever, it kind of loses joy of the hobby to a certain extent, which is why I love your tanks and the way you set them up, and all the displays you do are absolutely incredible, and makes you feel like you literally are grabbing almost a piece of Australia or the jungle or wherever it is, and putting them in tanks. So yeah.
Well, I don't like. Who doesn't like going to the zoo and seeing an amazing looking exhibit?
Absolutely.
So
yeah,
I want people to be able to have that in their homes.
Yeah, yeah, and then maybe so the flip of that, we've been talking about going bigger this entire episode, and obviously if you have the space, go bigger, and but you also mentioned obviously not everybody has the ability to. I don't know what that snake is doing. Obviously, you not everyone has the ability to. So maybe let's flip the question again a little bit. And do you think it's possible for someone to have almost a zoo type display in a smaller size enclosure?
Yes, but again, you need to really be selective with what animals you are getting. If you are getting a new animal and you don't have the space for an appropriate enclosure, then reconsider your choice on what the animal is. Let's go away from reptiles. If you wanted a horse, but you only had a backyard, you wouldn't be able to get a horse, would you?
Right.
You can't just shove a horse in a backyard. And yes, horses move around a lot more, but I think we underestimate what we should be providing for our animals, especially lizards. Lizards move around a lot, and yet I see them jammed into small enclosures all the time. Even carpet pythons, people are carpet pythons, they just sit around and do nothing. I was like, yeah, but if you provide them with something to do, you provide them with a functional space, they move around a lot.
Yeah. My carpets are never not moving.
Yeah. So
24/7.
Yeah, I don't think you have to be really selective. If you've only got a small amount of space to work with, then try and find a smaller animal that you're interested in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Does that suck? Yes. If you want something bigger, maybe start looking for a bigger place. But the animal shouldn't be making the sacrifice. You should.
Oh, absolutely. That makes sense. And I'll tell you, I'll say this, I don't think I've ever really said this story on the podcast before, but I was in the Middle East and we were just kind of walking around the desert, and I could not find any reptiles at all. And I'm talking like we walked like for what was for me a very long distance, what for a lizard would have been what I assume days to cover. And we eventually did start seeing reptiles, but they were so far in, and then our way out, again, what is a distance from where all the reptiles were, we found a tiny little Trigonodactylus. So how it got there, I don't know. Whether the adult female walked all that to lay an egg and then walked back, or that little baby was exploring on its own, or whatever it is. But for a tiny gecko that small to walk that far of a distance, it kind of makes you rethink of like how much space each of these animals are really using. Absolutely.
Could have even been some form of predation if a
Something
bird
picked
had
it up
grabbed
and
it or something,
yeah,
and then
yeah,
it had managed to wriggle free and get dropped.
for sure. Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
or even if it was on, say, there was a bird making a nest and it was in the clump of sticks or whatever. There's lots of different ways that it could have got there, but yeah, it's pretty crazy.
It's yeah, they're moving a lot. They're moving
Yeah,
a
I
lot.
think they move a lot more than we give them credit for sure. Especially, like, it's easy for people to make excuses. You hear it in the ball python world all the time. Nah, it's okay to stick them in a drawer because they spend most of their time in burrows. It's like, okay, but what about the time they don't spend in
What about
burrows?
the yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Also,
and
you know
and
what
I don't know if
else
any
spends a lot of time in burrows? Wombats. You would never go to a zoo and see a wombat stuck in a cupboard.
yeah,
They build
no,
an
absolutely.
enclosure that provides both the time in the burrow and out of the burrow.
Yeah, exactly. And to those people, has anyone ever actually like put the ball python in enclosure, turned off the lights, and see what they do overnight? Because those things are cruising all
Yeah.
night. They're balled up during the day, but they're just on the constant move, or at least the ones that I've seen. Yeah, it's very interesting. Cool, Damien. We'll start wrapping it up on this then. How can we? How can more people, the average keeper in their home, do more zoo-like display setups?
Okay, first thing you want to do is take the animals into consideration. Then work out what the function is for supporting their natural behaviors. One of the coolest things you will ever experience is unlocking a new natural behavior. It's like being on a PlayStation, new achievement unlocked. Like,
Yeah, for real.
it is an absolute thrill. The first time I saw my snakes, well, him in particular, straight over that water, I was like, huh, that's cool. The first time I saw them drinking from the misting system, um, seeing them feel comfortable sitting out and basking, cryptic basking essentially under visual barriers, actually it makes it so you can actually see your animal instead of it just being stuffed under a hide. So you need to think about the animal, think about the natural behaviors, and then work out what features, what functional features you need to include. And that might be getting a taller enclosure, that might be getting a longer enclosure, it might be getting an enclosure that you can provide deeper substrate so they burrow. Um, but yeah, first thing you need to do is look at those natural behaviors and look at how to support them. From there, you can work out what you want it to look like. So once you work out what you want it to look like, and it can be anything, like I've got Thailand themed enclosures with, like, it looks like a jungle with a Buddha head half submerged into the substrate and plants growing around. None of these animals are from Thailand, but it serves the feature and it looks how I want it to look.
Absolutely.
So yeah, function first. You get to that by studying the animal, and then you can go appearance. I would recommend starting with artificial plants. And then when you want to move into bioactive or live plants, maybe leave the plant in the pot to start with. Make sure that if you can see like little fertilizer balls and stuff, maybe do a soil change, and then put it back in the pot. But that means that you don't have to have all of your substrate supporting that plant. So you can put it in the pot, leave the pot in there. You can chuck moss and stuff on top of it, bury it down into the substrate so you can't see it. And then if the plant does well, you can leave it there. If it doesn't, you can remove it. Once you do that and start working out how to support plants with lighting and watering and all of that sort of thing, the humidity levels, Then you can go into things like bioactive substrates. So your substrate needs nutrients, but it also needs to be safe nutrients for your animals. So I use worm castings as the only fertilizer that I use because it's nice and safe. I don't use any chemical stuff. There are, if you're doing, say you're doing a pond and you want aquatic plants, you can do something like a dirted substrate like what mine is, or you could get, there are like liquid fertilizers that are fish tank safe. You just put a couple of drops in your fish tank and it supports all the plant life. So you could do something like that because it's already an animal safe product. Don't just go and get your hydroponic fertilizers and put that in because they are not safe for animals to drink. And yeah, from there, you just make sure you've got good ventilation if you're going to go bioactive. The more adjustable the ventilation, the easier it's going to be, but that can be tricky. But you can make panels. If you've got a mesh top enclosure, you can make panels to block off certain percentages of that top, which will allow you to trap more heat as well as have ventilation. You see dark frog people do it a lot by having like glass panels and stuff over the top of theirs.
That's what I used to
Just
do with
think
dark frog
that,
days as well.
yeah, think that, but on a larger scale. If it's an enclosed setup, like what mine are, you need to make sure you've got a ton of ventilation. Most people skimp on it because the vents themselves are quite expensive. But so is vet trip. Like, you're better off spending the money on creating something that's going to save you money long term. And pretty much save your animals. Like, it's up to us to provide a safe environment. So yeah, make sure it's got good ventilation if you're going to go live plants and bioactive substrates, and do heaps and heaps of research first. And keep an eye on your animals as well. You don't want to just ignore it and go, oh, no, it looks good. That's how I want it. If your animal's not doing well in it, then it's not going to work.
For sure. The animals
pretty
always
much
come first. Absolutely.
Yeah, has to.
Yeah, absolutely awesome. And for Copperhead Customs, is there any future plans or directions that you want to take that?
Yeah, so my future plan, I want to take the business model of a furniture store and bring it into the reptile world. So the biggest flaw I see with reptile shops is they only stock small enclosures that, in my opinion, are not suitable for adult animals. I think that's a really big problem in the industry, and I know why it happens. It's because if you had enclosures this size in your shop's going to fill up really, really fast. So my solution to that, and it goes down to what I was saying about borrowing from other industries, was, okay, well, how do other industries do it? How do car sellers do it? They've either got a car yard or they've got a showroom. How do furniture shops do it? They've got a showroom. You find what you want. You get to see how it works, and then you place your order and it gets made. So I want to set up almost like a miniature zoo that's got
like
fully set up enclosures. Yeah, a gallery. Fully set up enclosures with adult animals, running equipment, so you can see that it works. You don't run it, oh yeah, but how am I going to heat it? Because you can see. You can see how I heat it, and we sell the products. So you'll be able to come in, you'll see what an adult carpet python looks like, instead of seeing a snake this big and going, yeah, that's cute, I'll get that. Because you see that happen, and they don't stay that small. They get 7 foot long and live for a really, really long time. But you see people like, oh, I'll get another one, I'll get another one, I'll get another one. They've got 6 carpet pythons under the age of 3 years old. It's like, okay, what happens in 10 years' time? Like, do you have the space?
Exactly.
So a big part of it is I want more space for my animals. So, and having a showroom is going to allow me to do that. But it's also good for the business because I want people to be able to have a long-term solution and see what they're getting into and see that it can be done bigger and better and learn how. There's nothing wrong with not knowing how to do it. What there's something wrong with is not wanting to learn how to do it.
Absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed. And then in terms of, and I don't know what sort of the range around you that you service is, but for the people that are within that range, can you let people know how to order from you and where to find you online as well?
Yep. So unfortunately, we can't do international. The shipping's just way too expensive. Although I've just released a product called the Habitat Art Print, and it's an artistic rendition of different environments. And they print, it's a UV print on a vinyl that is self-adhesive for enclosures. And those I'm pretty sure I can freight worldwide.
That's awesome.
I saw it I was putting an order through the other day and it had different country options. So I was like, oh, that's interesting. But yeah, they're not photos, they're artistic renders of different environments. And I am releasing, I think it's 4 or 5 collections a month is what I'm aiming to release. And each collection's got about 8 images in it of different aspects and stuff, so they suit different enclosures. But yeah, my pages are all Copperhead Customs, and then I've tagged onto the back because my wife made a point of it doesn't really describe what we do. So it's Copperhead Customs, bespoke backgrounds, and habitat creation. And that's across, I'm on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook.
And as always, you will find all those links in the show notes. Damian, thank you very, very much for coming on and doing this, man. That was a fascinating conversation. And I think a lot of people have a lot to learn from you and from your methods. So I look forward to seeing future builds, because I'm sure they're only going to get bigger and better. And keep me updated.
I'm going to try and put a lot more informational stuff out. I've got to get more active on
yeah, man,
YouTube.
do it. Absolutely. Yeah. When you start doing that as well, let me know and I'll share that stuff too. Because yeah, definitely,
absolutely,
you definitely should be. That's awesome. Yeah. So once again, Damian, thank you very much. And for everybody else, thank you for listening. Go check out Damian's pages. Go check out those builds, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you guys.